In the drylands where the wind carried whispers of forgotten battles and the sun painted the earth with gold and fire, there lived a man known only as El Apache Solitario, the Lone Apache, a figure who walked the edge between myth and truth, feared by some, revered by others, but known to all as a soul who had chosen solitude after the violence of war had taken his family and tribe. He carried in his heart the ashes of loss, yet his spirit was not hardened like stone but softened like clay, touched by rain. And one evening, as he rode his weary horse across a valley scarred by centuries of sorrow, he came upon a sight that stopped him cold. A woman crumpled on the earth, her body marked with bruises, her eyes swollen with tears, her arms weakly shielding three small girls who clung to her, girls no older than flowers just beginning to bloom. And the Lone Apache dismounted, his shadow falling across her pain, and he saw in her trembling form the echo of every injustice he had witnessed, the cruelty of men who forgot that life itself is sacred, and he bent low, his voice deep yet gentle, saying words that would change her life. Forever, tu vienes conmigo, you come with me, not as property, not as burden, but as human being, as mother, as someone who deserved dignity. And though she could barely lift her eyes, she understood in that moment that this man, feared as a warrior, was offering something greater than protection. He was offering hope, and so the story began, not of conquest, but of compassion, of a wanderer who chose to carry not weapons alone but the weight of another's suffering. And as the sun set, painting the sky with red that looked almost like blood but felt instead like rebirth, he lifted the woman gently onto his horse, her daughters climbing up with tiny hands that clutched his worn leather shirt, and together they rode away from the shadows of her torment, into the unknown where possibility flickered like the first star of night. The woman's name was Marisol, though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in many years, for her husband had treated her name as a curse, spitting it with disdain each time she bore a child that was not the son he demanded, as though the miracle of life itself could be reduced to the cruelty of expectation. When she bore 3 daughters, each as radiant as the sunlit petals of desert blossoms, he saw not blessings but failures, and his fists became the punctuation of his rage. And it was in one of those storms of violence that she fled, stumbling into the wilderness with her children, not knowing if she would find death or salvation, only knowing she could no longer live under the weight of hatred. And it was then that the Lone Apache appeared, not by chance, she would later believe, but by the mysterious weaving of fate that places the right souls at the right crossroads. For days they traveled in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional cry of the girls who were hungry. And though food was scarce, the warrior shared every crumb he had, even going without for himself, his frame lean and scarred but fueled by something stronger than bread, the conviction that no one should suffer alone. Marisol watched him, first with suspicion, then with curiosity, and slowly with a gratitude so deep it frightened her, because she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen not as a burden but as a human being worthy of care. Yet the journey was not without peril, for cruelty has a way of chasing those who escape it. And one night, under the cloak of darkness, men came riding, her husband and his brothers, enraged that she had fled, furious that she dared to seek freedom, and they carried ropes and weapons, ready to drag her back not for love but for pride. And as they closed in, Marisol's heart nearly broke, fearing that all hope was illusion. But El Apache Solitario stood firm, his silhouette outlined by firelight, and though he had no army, his presence was enough to give them pause, for they knew his reputation, and in his eyes burned not only the fire of a fighter but the unshakable calm of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to defend. And with words like thunder he told them that the desert itself would rise against them if they tried to take her, that to strike her again would be to strike the very earth. And though they mocked him, calling him mad, they hesitated, for in the silence between heartbeats they felt something larger than fear, something that whispered of justice. And whether by courage or by miracle, they turned back, leaving Marisol trembling but free. And in that moment she realized that true strength was not the fist that struck but the hand that shielded. Days turned to weeks, and as they traveled from canyon to river, from mountain shadow to prairie wind, the bond between them grew, not of romance at first but of humanity, of two broken spirits finding in each other a mirror of resilience. The girls laughed more now, their bellies filled with roots and berries, their faces kissed by sunlight rather than shadow. And Marisol began to remember fragments of herself, the girl she had once been before life taught her fear, the mother who could cradle without shame, the woman who could walk with her head lifted. The Lone Apache, too, changed, for though he had long lived in solitude, carrying only the ghosts of his fallen kin, he began to hear laughter again, began to feel that perhaps his exile was not a punishment but a preparation, so that he could one day carry others toward freedom. Yet the world is never simple, and one evening they reached a village where people looked at Marisol and her daughters not with welcome but with judgment, whispering that a woman with 3 girls and no husband must be cursed, that she must have done something to deserve her suffering. And though their words were knives, the Lone Apache stood beside her like a mountain, declaring aloud for all to hear that daughters were not curses but treasures, that the strength of a nation lay not only in its warriors but in its women, and that anyone who mocked them was blind to the beauty of creation. His voice silenced the crowd, and in the stillness, a few women stepped forward, offering bread and water, their eyes softening as if his courage had unlocked their compassion, and Marisol wept, because she had never known a man who defended her dignity so fiercely without asking anything in return. It was then that an unexpected turn unfolded. One of the daughters fell ill, fever burning through her small body, and panic surged in Marisol's chest as memories of helpless nights under her husband's roof returned, when no one cared if the children lived or died. But now she was not alone, for the Lone Apache carried the child in his arms, searching desperately for medicine, and when they found an elder healer in a hidden canyon, he knelt beside her, begging not for himself but for the child, his voice breaking with urgency. And in that moment Marisol saw something extraordinary, that this man who had lost his own children long ago was pouring all his love into hers, that he was willing to give everything for little lives that were not his by blood but by choice. And she understood then that family is not always born, sometimes it is forged by the fire of kindness. And when the fever broke days later, and the girl opened her eyes to the light, Marisol felt as though she, too, had been reborn. The road ahead was still uncertain, but each step taught them something profound, that love is not weakness but the greatest strength, that kindness can redraw the maps of destiny, that one act of compassion can ripple through generations like water through stone, carving new paths of possibility. Marisol, once beaten and silenced, now walked with dignity, carrying her daughters not as burdens but as blessings, and the Lone Apache, once lost in grief, now carried purpose, no longer merely a shadow of vengeance but a beacon of protection and hope. Their journey became known in whispers across villages, the tale of the Lone Apache who chose to protect rather than destroy, the man who lifted a woman and her daughters from despair, not because he sought glory but because he understood that to save one soul is to heal the world. And people who heard the story began to question their own cruelty, their own silence, and in some small way, hearts began to change. And so, as years passed, the daughters grew into strong women, their laughter echoing across canyons, their lives living proof that cycles of violence can be broken, that the choices of one man, one protector, can shape futures unseen. Marisol, her scars still present but no longer her identity, found her voice and shared her story with others, telling women that they were not alone, that even in the darkest night there may come a voice saying, "Tu vienes conmigo," a voice that means not possession but deliverance, not chains but wings. And El Apache Solitario, though still a wanderer, was no longer lonely, for he carried within him the lives he had saved, the love he had rekindled, the truth that humanity is most powerful not in conquest but in compassion. And in the end, the lesson of their story was not about tribes or nations, not even about man or woman, but about the universal heartbeat of kindness. That when one human being dares to lift another from the dust, both are transformed, and the world itself becomes brighter. And so, dear listener, if ever you see someone broken by cruelty, if ever you meet a soul convinced they are worthless, remember this tale, remember the Lone Apache and the mother of 3 girls, and let your heart be the one to whisper, "You come with me," for in those simple words lies the power to heal, to inspire, and to change everything.